Aí, agora sim.
Welcome all to the second SILF Roundtable, Funcionalismo e Funcionalismos. Today, I have the honor of moderating this session, in which three dear colleagues will present their works, each of them representing a functionalist point of view. Hella Olbertz will present about pseudoclefts in functional discourse grammar. Renata Enghels will talk about the historical rise of inchoative auxiliary verbs, comparing grammaticalization and constructionalization theories. And Carlos Gouveia will be speaking about aspectos de coesão lexical em português europeu. First, I will briefly introduce our speakers, thanking them for accepting our invitation. Professor Hella Olbertz is a visiting scholar at the Spanish Department of University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. From 2010 to 2014, she was the coordinator of the Discursive Functional Grammar Research Group at the University of Amsterdam. And since 2015, she has been secretary of the Functional Discourse Grammar Foundation. She was also a visiting professor at Unesp Bilse and at Universidade Estadual de Feira de Santana. Her main research interest concerns the semantic and syntactic aspects of variation and change in Spanish and Portuguese, within, of course, the theoretical framework of functional discourse grammar. Hella has also developed works about modality and verbal aspect, as well as the grammaticalization of the expression of these categories, with the emphasis on differences between those languages, those two languages, and their European and American varieties. Renata Enghels is a professor of Hispanic and General Romance Linguistics at the Faculty of Arts and Philosophy of Ghent University in, my dear, as you know, Belgium. She is a researcher in different research groups. The Center for the Social Study of Migration and Refugees, the research group Crossing the Border Between English and Spanish, and the Ghent University Research Group on Linguistic Meaning and Structure. Her investigation has specialized in corpus research from a functional and cognitive perspective. Renata has a particular interest in verbal argument structures and focuses on the functional relations between formal syntactic structure in Romance languages and especially in Spanish. The semantic and pragmatic roles of linguistic unities and their morphological markings. She directs PhD theses on topics ranging from the polysemy of perception verbs and put verbs, discourse markers, the verbal nominalizations in terms of address. Our last speaker is Professor Carlos Gouveia, who is an associate professor with aggregation at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Lisbon, where he has taught since 1986. He's also a researcher of the UTEC, Selga UTEC, isn't it? Where he has been carrying out his scientific research activities since 2006, and where he is the coordinator of the research group Discourse and Literacy. Carlos works in the scientific areas of applied linguistics and discourse analysis, and his main areas of interest are genre-based approaches to L1 and L2 teaching and learning, writing development in Portuguese, the lexical grammar of address forms in Portuguese, like Renata, systemic functional linguistics description of Portuguese, power and hegemony in scientific practice and the social discursive construction of identity. So thank you all for accepting our invitation again. We will begin with Professor Hella Olbertz, and the floor is all yours, Hella.
Okay. Momentinho.
With Marise assistance.
Share screen.
From Amsterdam.
Yeah. Is this one? Isso. Não, isso. Agora você vai aqui. Né? Ah, tá. Ah, que bom. Agora eu vou começar. Obrigada, Flavia. Well, thank you. What I didn't tell you, I forgot, is to tell you that I'm talking about Spanish. So I hope this is not a problem. The structure of my talk is very simple. I start with description of cleft constructions in Spanish. Then I present the theory with which I'm going to work to solve the problem, and then apply the theory, right? So first to the description. Thank you. I can continue, right? You hear me? You hear me? Do you hear me? Yes? Okay, thank you. So first I'm going to present pseudoclefts, then the structure of pseudoclefts, and then the pragmatics of pseudoclefts.
Hella, just a moment. Your screen is not yet shared.
Okay.
You could try again?
Yes, of course.
Que é igual a inglês? É esse aqui?
Tu está. Right? Does it work? No?
Yes, that's great. No, it was the other one. Yeah, it's great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, once again, so I'm sorry, I have to start all over again. So the structure is very simple. You heard me saying this, okay? First, the description. I first present pseudoclefts, then I go into the structure of pseudoclefts, and then into the grammatics of pseudoclefts. First, todo funciona muy bien aquí, la gente es muy amable, pero lo que queremos es regresar a casa. This is what some evacuees from a fire in California say. No más contestaciones, no quiero periodistas, no me hacen falta ya. Ahora morirme es lo que quiero. Locke, introduces pseudoclefts in as in one, or reverse pseudoclefts as in two. The focus may be on a concrete entity, on an event, or on a proposition. Here, I'm going to focus only on concrete entities and events. Locke is the most used element in pseudoclefts and reverse pseudoclefts. There are also some with quien, la que, el que, which all means who, but Locke clearly is predominant. Pseudoclefts divide the sentence into two components. Me gusta el pescado, lo que me gusta, headless relative, is, which is just a linking element, the copula, and the fish of focal MP. Pseudoclefts are identificational constructions, lo que me gusta, es el pescado. Therefore, the order of the components can be reversed. El pescado es lo que me gusta. El pescado es lo que me gusta. Está mal así. The focal constituent is often causal. For A, lo que quiero es divertirme. And for B, divertirme es lo que quiero. Reverse Pseudocleft. 5. Lo que quiero es que me escuches. O que me escuches es lo que quiero. In Spanish, co-reference of actor argument requires non-finiteness, like in for, divertirme, and non-co-reference requires finiteness, like in 5. Both 4 and 5 focus on an event. So let's first look at straightforward pseudoclefts with regard to the pragmatics. Como habrá visto, no llevo encima ni grabadoras, ni cables, ni nada. Tampoco vengo de parte de otra persona o con un encargo. Lo que pido es un favor personal. Y 7, no es bueno que crezcas solo. Lo que necesitas es un amigo. Debes tener un amigo de verdad, Elio. Pseudoclefts focus on new information. So, un favor personal is what is new. Un amigo is also what is new. Okay? And now, reverse pseudoclefts are different. Hay que ordenar todo y reescribir bastantes cosas. Ya sabes lo que decía el argentinito Macedonio Fernández. Corregir es la clave del éxito. Corregir es lo que nos vuelve geniales. En 9, no bebas, Ricardo. Te estás matando. Beber es lo que me está matando. No digas bobadas. So what happens here is that reverse pseudoclefts focus on given information. Corregir is given earlier, and the same holds for beber. Okay? Oh, sorry. And now let's go on to the role of the context. ¿Qué dices, papá? Sí, he tenido una buenísima educación, he tenido todo lo que se podía tener. Lo que has tenido es buena suerte. Y ahora estás teniendo mala suerte. And in 11, me encanta ir al cine, me gusta leer, pero lo que más me gusta de todo es dormir. So, the content of the headless relative clause is not new, but contrasts with the immediately previous context. So, he tenido una buenísima educación, he tenido todo, lo que has tenido es something very different. ¿Eh? En 11, me encanta, me gusta, pero lo que más me gusta, ¿no? So, how to account for the structure and pragmatics of reverse pseudoclefts? Well, the key is in functional discourse grammar. What is functional discourse grammar? Which is what I will first discuss, and then I will go into two details. I'm sorry. General features of functional discourse grammar are the following. Functional discourse grammar, or FDG, is a model of grammar based on typological implicational hierarchies and tendencies. The model is conceived as an instrument for the description of individual languages. FDG does not presuppose a universal grammar. Universal tendencies and hierarchies are the result of empirical research. The model does not allow for the movement or deletion of any material specified in the course of analysis. So this is quite an ambitious project, isn't it? FTG is a form-oriented approach. What does that mean? Look at 12a, me pasas la miel, por favor, and 12b, pásame la miel, por favor. Form-oriented means that 12a is a question and 12b is an imperative, despite the fact that both share the same communicative intention, obviously. No? The communicative intention is not supposed to form part of the grammar. That means that there is no direct link between cognition and expression. FTG is a function to form approach, and this means that the speaker's intention here is the driving force of verbal formulation. That is the creation of linguistic content, which then passes through the encoding through morphosyntactic and morphonological encoding, and ends in oral, written, or signed expression. And in this representation, the rectangles are outside grammar. Well, all this process corresponds to psychological adequacy. Functional discourse grammar forms part of a wider model of interaction. Here we've got the grammatical component, which should be with two M's, I'm sorry about that, which consists basically in formulation and encoding. Outside this grammar, there are three other components. The conceptual component, which is responsible for the speaker intention. The contextual component, which contains situational information and which stacks the products of linguistic interaction so that the most recent contribution is at the highest level, can be immediately accessed. And then we've got the output component, which corresponds to spoken, written, or signed input, which of course is individually different and cannot be predicted by a grammar. Okay, formulation and encoding more concretely consist of interpersonal part, that is a pragmatic part, and a representational part, which corresponds to semantic description. Encoding corresponds to more syntax, and so syntax, also word order, and things, and phonology. So the starting point is not syntax, but pragmatics, okay? And we are going to talk only about the formulation part. So, finally, everything is highly formalized. I will give you a number of formula, and I'll try to explain them as good as I can. FTG aims to provide a descriptively, psychologically, and typologically adequate framework. In order to test this, we need formalization. That is, formalization serves to make the descriptions of linguistic data as well as the claims and predictions derived from these data rigorous and controllable. In this way, predictions can be tested, substantiated, or rejected. At each level, FTG, and now we go into the formalization, takes the form of frames. In this frame, P is any operator that is grammatical modifier. V is any variable. Head obviously is head, mostly lexical, well, generally lexical. Sigma, which is here, is any modifier of this head, a lexical modifier, for instance, adjectives and adverbs. Phi, which you see here, are functions. That is relational grammatical elements, like functions like at the descriptive level, representational level, actor and undergoer, which are general functions which cover, among others, of course, agent and patient. That's more than that. The ordering principles of these frames are a matter of convention and do not reflect the actual order of the elements involved. Possible word order templates are provided at the morphosyntactic level. So, the basic unit at the interpersonal level is the Discourse Act. The Discourse Act is the smallest identifiable unit of communicative behavior. The basic frame for the Discourse Act is as follows. A is Discourse Act. F is any illocutionary predicate, which may be abstract or lexical. P are participants, 1 and 2, as you see, in the interaction, which have functions, speaker and addressee. And C is the communicated content. The communicated content is the entity that corresponds to also to lower level elements at the representational level. So, but at the interpersonal level, there is mostly evocation, but also some grammatical information. You have the subject of ascription, which is in Searle's term predication, and the subact of reference, one or more subacts of reference, which you see here. The square levels indicate equivalent relations, and the round levels, parentheses, indicate hierarchy. Okay. So an example. Qué guapa está María. How good Maria is looking. We have an exclamative here. And Maria also has the name has no descriptive value, and therefore it is interpersonal predicate. Qué guapa está usted. Here, the choice of usted is formal, so we have a honorific operator in the addressee participant. And in the referent, we have abstract predicate, which corresponds to you, that is not speaker but addressee, not minus speaker plus addressee. The communicated content has modifiers, operators, and functions. 15. Diz que você está preparando alguma coisa. Here, the main communicated content contains is given in gray because it's not a matter of the of the interpersonal level, but at the interpersonal level there is the modification by means of GISCE, reportedly. 16. I want to have a cat. So the article or definiteness, non-definiteness is also accounted at the level of the interpersonal level, which means that it is not identifiable for the addressee, and in this special case also not for the speaker, because the speaker doesn't know the cat yet. Eso lo hizo mi marido. Literally, this made my husband. Spanish allows for postponement of the subject, which is not possible in Portuguese, I believe. So postponing the subject has the effect of vocalizing the subject. So we have a focus function in the corresponding referential subact. Pragmatic functions work as follows. Focus is opposed to background. Topic is opposed to comment. A contrast is opposed to overlap. In each case, it is the first value for which we normally find linguistic manifestations. That is, it is the marked value. In this approach, however, the marked function is not, the marked functions are not in opposition to each other, and therefore they may be combined. Now, let's go to the representational level of linguistic description. Basic representational frame, much simplified for our purposes enough. P is the propositional content. E is a state of affairs, that is any kind of event. FC, the configurational property, which consists basically of the predicate and its arguments, which is needed for instance, phrasal aspect. F, the predicate, and X, the individual. Let's return to our example, que guapa está María. Estar is, in Spanish, a predicate of temporary situation. So it is progressive, the value it expresses. And guapo is an adjective, and the final form of the adjective will be given in the morphological level. Now, semantics in FTG, which is what the representational level is about, the relation is the relation that obtains between language and the world it described. Designation, basically. Ideation in Halliday, Darstellung in Bühler, and representation in FTG. Semantic categories are independent of interpersonal categories, and universal semantics are supposed not to exist. Now, let's look at the state of affairs function, which is important for us. Functions and operators. I saw the swans. Past here. Singular operator in the agentive element, which is I. And a plural operator in the swan. I has actor function and swan undergoer function. Okay, M means just more than one. Rafael Nadal is winning. The present and the progressive, of course, in the on the configuration of property, and winning is adjective. The meeting was boring. Past. Boring is the predicate, and the meeting is an event predicate. An event, an event predicate, because meeting describes an event, and it has undergoer function because the meeting doesn't do anything. Okay. So how does FTG help to account for the structure and pragmatics of reverse or non-reverse pseudoclefts? Now, the structure of pseudoclefts in FTG and then the pragmatics of pseudoclefts in FTG. First, the headless relative clause. Example, lo que necesitas es un amigo, ¿no? Lo que necesitas. First part. Headless relatives are configurational heads of linguistic entities. Right? You remember the head, right? Which is lexical, basically. An individual in the case of 22. The construction is such that the linguistic entity is identified through the state of affairs in which it is involved. So, to explain this, so lo que refers to this, but lo que participates here in the state of affairs, which contains necesitar as a predicate and two arguments, the one who needs and the one who is needed. And these two are co-referential. The whole, the X element ends here. Lo que le pido es un favor personal. It is analogous with the exception that favor is an event noun. Favor has to be done, consists of an action. In addition, it has to undergo a function as well. In addition, we have a third argument, the one from whom the favor is being required. And 24, finally, is regresar a casa in focus. Lo que refers to this. So lo que is an event, but the entire thing is an event and which is been involved here. So querer, yo, yeah, and here the event, the favor. Okay. Now we have first a relative headless relative clause and focal component, which is now un amigo. And here it is presented singular and amigo, a noun. What I look at, pido es un favor personal. Here we have personal favor, event noun, and which is such that personal favor, such that favor, such it is that it is personal. So this is a modifier of favor, of favor. Pardon. Sorry. Lo que queremos es regresar a casa, and here we have the event, which consists of return, we as actors, and a casa is a location, which has additive function that is a directional function. Okay, now the pragmatics of pseudoclefts. Here I have a dramatic story. Mi abuela tuvo mellizas, cosa que no sabía porque no iban al médico. Cuando salía la primera hija, la comadrona se fue. Mi abuela le gritaba que todavía tengo algo. Y le contestó, lo que tienes es un tumor. Y se fue. Mi abuela le dijo a su marido, no te muevas de aquí, que tengo otro hijo. Y así tuvo la segunda melliza con su marido.
Hella.
So,
Hella, we have
I
5 more minutes, okay?
What you have is a tumor. So, yeah, and I also already said that we have something mentioned earlier, and then the loci sentence, the free relative, does not contain anything new, but it is contrasting. Huh? So we have contrast function here on tener, and here we have tú. So the direction to the addressee and singular. Okay. The focal, we have a focal referent, which is non-identified, un tumor, and singular. Okay. This example we already know. I will read it in English. As you will have seen, I don't have recorders, cables, or video systems on me or anything like. Also, I'm not coming on behalf of anybody else or on an errand. What I'm asking is a personal favor. So, things are very similar, only that we have first person referent here. Huh? So, speaker and singular, I. And the focal clause is, as I said, an event and non-identified, so un, indefinite article, favor personal. So within the referent, we have two ascriptive acts, favor and personal. And the whole is focal. And here we have another example for the event. Y eso es todo lo que hacemos. Somos el número 1 en redes informáticas y estamos a gusto con ello. No necesitamos ser nada más, ni fusionarnos o comprar. Lo que queremos es hacer productos fabulosos durante mucho, mucho tiempo. So this is lo que queremos is in contrast with the earlier information. So again, we have contrast function on the ascriptive act, the corresponding to querer. We have first person, but now not singular, but plural. And in the focal clause, we have do, and then a referential subact with plural, and two ascriptive subacts, producto fabuloso. And this is undergoer. And this whole thing is in focus. Finally, let's look at a reverse pseudocleft. Hay que ordenar todo, etc. I read it in English now. You have to put everything in the right order and rewrite a lot. Remember what the little Argentinian Macedonian Fernando said? Correcting is the key to success. Correcting is what makes us brilliant. So, now, the focal clause is the first part. Corregir is actually an event, but it is an event noun because it doesn't have arguments here. And it has been mentioned earlier, so it's topical, but at the same time, it's focal. So this is what you can do in FDG, topical focus. Focal topic. And then at the relative clause, we have the causative volver, and genial as genial as an adjective, and we, speaker and addressee inclusive.
Hella, we have 1 more minute.
It's focus again, but contrastive focus, contrasting with what, with es la clave del éxito. Yeah? Okay, concluding. Pseudocleft constructions are new focus constructions as opposed to reverse pseudoclefts with given focus. A pseudocleft consists of a headless relative clause and a focal constituent. The representational structure of the headless relative is such that the linguistic entity at issue is identified through the event it is involved in. The 3 types of pseudoclefts that have been presented vary according to the nature of the focal constituent. First, a noun phrase referring to a concrete entity, a noun phrase referring to an event, and third, a non-finite clause referring to an event, both as the straightforward and the reverse type. The pragmatics of pseudocleft is taken care of by the interpersonal level layer at functional discourse grammar, which interacts in many ways with the representational structure of the construction. I hope to have shown that FDG is capable of providing a satisfactory account to this construction type. And here we've got some references, and I thank you very much for your patience. And now I'm going to stop sharing, yeah?
Yes. Thank you, Hella.
Can you just...
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Flavia.
Yeah, it's okay.
No. No estava ouvindo. Do you know?
No, it's okay?
It's okay, yeah.
Thank you very much, Hella. I noticed you were without the phones.
I haven't, but you could hear me, couldn't you?
Yeah, of course. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah. And now it's Professor Renata Enghels with the book Toren behind her, for those of you who haven't been in Ghent. Renata, my pleasure.
Hi. Okay, I will look for the screen that I want to share. Okay. Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay, so you see my screen. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here, and especially thank you to the organizers of this conference for inviting me to participate in this interesting round table. Now, the overarching topic of my talk today is how functionalism and functionalisms, as the central theme of this round table, how they have dealt with language change. So before we begin, let us take a helicopter view to observe when the different ization theories emerge in the course of linguistic research. Now, the following graphs, which I have taken from the Scopus database, they show the number of studies dedicated to lexicalization as a topic, grammaticalization, pragmaticalization, and finally, constructionalization. And well, a very quick comparison of these data learns, first of all, that lexicalization and grammaticalization are by far the most widespread approaches to language change. And secondly, that more recently, as you can see here, as to the year of publication, two notions have entered the battlefield in the 21st century, namely first pragmaticalization and then more recently constructionalization. Now, in my talk today, I will mainly be interested in the relationship between grammaticalization and also, of course, constructionalization. Now, what we have here is that the graph shows that the constructionalization theory may have led to some temporary dips, but certainly has not slowed down the steady march of grammaticalization as a dominant approach to language change. So the question is what the overall impact has been and still is of the constructional approaches to language change. So hence the main topic of my talk today, which is to compare grammaticalization and constructionalization, so both approaches, to the well-known development of full lexical verbs into auxiliary verbs. And I will focus on the highly interesting but understudied inchoative construction in Spanish. Now, as the following examples show, in Spanish, verbs from quite different source fields seem to have been reanalyzed to finally function as a spectral inchoative auxiliary verb. So here, for instance, we have Juan rompe a llorar, literally meaning John breaks to cry, but in fact it means John starts to cry. Or here, Juan salta a ayudar, John jumps to help, he starts to help. And finally, Juan se echa a reír, John literally throws himself to laugh, or he starts to laugh. And today, we will be particularly interested in the historical path that is followed by throw verbs, such as echar. Now, the specific goals are the following ones. So first of all, from a theoretical point of view, I will highlight the complementarity between grammaticalization and constructionalization accounts as respect to the rise of auxiliaries and verbal periphrases. And then secondly, against this theoretical background, in the second part of the presentation, we will then turn to the inchoative construction in Spanish. And I will first reconstruct the process by which the full lexical throw verbs, as we saw before, came to fulfill an aspectual auxiliary role. So I will first do it through the lens of grammaticalization theories, and then I will propose an alternative but complementary constructional view. Okay, but let us first take a closer look at how a functional approach to language change has led then to these differentization theories that we saw before. Now, first, to keep it simple, I would like to start by highlighting the main common ideas between grammaticalization, pragmaticalization, etc., common ideas that also underlie my own approach. So first of all, they are, of course, all concerned with language as a communicative system. Secondly, they are fundamentally usage-based. And in fact, language is seen as the product of interlocutors in discourse. And of course, it's not seen as a system with an independent life. So they look at change as the outcome of processes of replication of a particular innovation, and also a particular selection by a community. Now, these processes of replication and selection, of course, they mostly concern linguistic features that are considered as communicatively important and convenient in a given speech situation. And then finally, functional approaches, they also mostly adopt a rather broad definition of grammar that includes both contentful or lexical elements, but also procedural or grammatical elements. Now, although most of you are probably very familiar with the theories of grammaticalization and constructionalization, now in what follows, I do want to give a very quick nutshell overview of some milestones in their state of the art. And I will end by pinpointing the main differences and similarities between grammaticalization and constructionalization, because they will lead the path towards the empirical case study. So very quickly, it would be almost a crime not to mention Mayet's work, and so his definition, of course, of grammaticalization as l'attribution du caractère grammatical à un mot jadis autonome. So as you know, it was a starting point of the grammaticalization as a reduction view, and in his 18 pages, Mayet, he set the agenda for the later research. So along came then Lehmann, who 70 years later started his detailed work on grammaticalization, which he then defined, as you can see here, as a process which turns lexemes into grammatical formatives and makes grammatical formatives still more grammatical. So he developed a set of parameters and processes that have been highly influential and also very important, empirically operationalizable. Then, at the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century, several scholars, including Traugott, Norde, Heine, they started to put into question that idea of unidirectionality of language change. They foregrounded cases of degrammaticalization, and they also proposed different hypotheses concerning the role of semantics. So, important, they also observed that grammaticalized items, they become more frequent, and in fact, their use should not be defined in terms of loss. So, from that moment on, grammaticalization was often seen in terms of gain rather than loss, as in, okay, there is a loss of lexical meaning, but gain of abstract and procedural meaning. However, what is important, so also for the purpose of my talk and the rise of auxiliaries and constructions, is the importance of context, so the context in which the changes occur. So this has been noted, as you know, by Himmelmann, who defines grammaticalization as content or context expansion, also known as host class expansion. And then this conception of language change set a tone for the subsequent model of language change in terms of constructional change and also constructionalization, as defined by Hilbert and also Traugott and Trousdale. So as a consequence, grammaticalization research increasingly interacted, and it also converged with the then emerging field of diachronic construction grammar or construction grammar in general. Okay, so a particularly appealing implication of the constructional view is the idea that, perception of relationships between patterns within a paradigm, they are said to be part of a competent speaker's knowledge. So everyone has that, that conception in mind. And so the central idea is then that if you have different expressions with analogous functions and also analogous formal characteristics, in fact, we conceive them as instances of an overarching construction. So interestingly, grammatical constructionalization focuses on how configurations of set of expressions changes. So this entails then that linguistic change, it does not only apply to particular linguistic item, for instance, one particular auxiliary, but it always involves network family members, and the interconnectedness between those members can take very different forms, and as we will see also in this presentation, has consequences both for the internal and also the external configuration of the network. So we will see that these tendencies also apply to the diachronic evolution of the throw subschema. Okay, so importantly, the constructionalization account does not aim to replace grammaticalization accounts, but in fact, it wants to be a complementary one. So for instance, there is often overlap in the kind of data that is studied in both models. Now, however, the authors that I mentioned before, so Hilbert, Traugott, Trousdale, they do highlight some benefits of the constructionalization account. And we will see that those benefits are also to be confirmed by our own case study. So first of all, it's interesting that they pay equal attention to both changes in form and in meaning. Secondly, the constructionalization account also foregrounds the role of analogy. So as I already mentioned before, so the idea is that change, and linguistic change, involves alignment within sets and also to sets. So the approach wants to gain insight in the emergence of new constructions, new constructional subschemas, and the place of individual items within the network. And then finally, and also interesting, so an added value of the constructionalization account is the fact that partially it's an onomasiological approach. So this means that instead of looking at semantic changes that affect individual lexical items alone, so it tries to track which meanings, so general semantic domains, for instance, can be recruited to schemas. Okay, so that for the theoretical background. The case study I will be developing here is also situated at the intersection of grammaticalization and diachronic construction grammar. Okay, so first I will define the notion of inchoative auxiliary, so a spectral inchoative auxiliary, or if you want, inchoative construction, so depending on the perspective one wants to take. And so the basic definition is very simple. So inchoative refers to the start of an event or a process, okay? Good. In the previous study on these inchoatives in Spanish, we found that Spanish is very productive as to this construction or these auxiliaries, and has at least 25 ways to express the start. So there are many different verbs that can appear in the auxiliary plus a plus infinitive construction. And we observe that at least 4 of this set of verbs, they pertain to the larger domain of throw verbs. So we have echar in Spanish, we have lanzar, arrojar, and tirar, which in fact could all be translated into English by to throw or to launch. So here are some concrete cases to illustrate what I'm saying here. So you have in A, los nuevos rebeldes se arrojaron a atacar. So literally, the new rebels, they started to attack the system. So this is the inchoative meaning. The literal meaning would then be they threw themselves, they launched themselves to attack the system. Or here in B, el niño abrió los ojos y echó a correr de regreso a su casa. The child opened his eyes and literally he threw himself to run back to his house. But of course, in contemporary Spanish, it means something like he started, so he quickly ran back to his house. Okay, so the process by which these full lexical throw verbs then came to fulfill the auxiliary role in the inchoative is in fact very suitable to be studied within a grammaticalization theory. So we could adopt a semasiological viewpoint and then ask how a particular individual referential expression, so for instance, echar, then gradually over time acquired that spectral meaning. And as you know, probably very interesting here is Heine's 4-step grammaticalization model, in which he includes first an initial stage with a full lexical meaning. We have the bridging context, and then the switch context, and then finally the stage of conventionalization. So I will first show that this model of Heine, grammaticalization model, can also be applied to the evolution of throw verbs towards inchoative auxiliaries. And I will show that there are like 5 different stages. I will try to diachronically situate the different stages of the process of grammaticalization. So as you can see here, and so it starts in the 13th century of Spanish, we end in the 20th century, and I will do this by verifying, by checking in 2 corpora, for instance, the Corpus Diacrónico del Español, when we have the first cases of the general pathway of grammaticalization. Okay, so let me walk you through the 5 stages. So the first stage, the starting point, is of course the concrete use of the verbs with a human agent subject and an inanimate object that is the theme. So this means really this is really the throw meaning, as you can see here, echar piedras, tirar piedras, lanzar piedras, which you could all translate as, of course, to throw rocks. So this is the starting point. In the second stage, the verb denotes the same kind of concrete movement, but now the change of state is applied not to an external object, but to the subject itself. So this is just to say that the throw verbs can be used pronominally. As for instance, in these cases, se echó, San Juan se echó a sus pies, so Saint John threw himself at his feet. So this is clearly a pronominal meaning. Then, the third step, what happens? Well, we have an abstract noun phrase that is added as a complement. So now we don't have a concrete location, but an abstract goal, such as, for instance, luxury, love, mystery. And so here, of course, the verb no longer denotes physical movement towards a concrete place, but direction towards an abstract state of affairs. So you could say then that the human agent subject throws himself or tends towards that abstract state of affairs. So for instance, in A, el alma del mezquino se echa a luxuria, the soul of the greedy man throws itself at luxury. So, in fact, here, and the combination with an abstract noun phrase opens the path for infinitives to be included in the pattern. And this is what we observe in the fourth stage. So here you see that the throw verb combined with an infinitive. And you could say then that what they mean is something like to throw him or herself to a place in order to do something. And in the first phase, the infinitive is mostly a movement verb. So these are the famous bridging context, because it's not always clear whether the verb expresses its original meaning of throwing or whether there is already some inchoative aspect. If we take a look here at the example, see, un hombre se arroja a nadar en ese lago. So a man throws himself to swim in the lake. So we do have the concrete launching in the lake, but we also have the infinitive in order to start to swim. So this is a bridging context. And then finally, the final stage, you could say that the throw verbs, they have completely grammaticalized, semantically bleached, and they are real inchoative auxiliaries. So the physical movement can no longer be conceived in the examples. So for instance, in A, dice que el pecador cae en desesperanza y se echa a fazer todo mal. The sinner falls into despair and he starts to do bad things. So the overview that I just gave shows that the aspectual meaning of to begin is connected to the literal meaning of throwing through a metaphorical extension, something like to throw a concrete object towards a concrete goal. It's like launching oneself first towards the concrete goal, then towards an abstract goal, which can then be an activity as expressed by an infinitive in order to start a new event. So there is clearly a metaphorical extension. Now, the corpus data confirm that echar is already used in the 13th century in Spanish, even, so it reaches stage 5, so even as an inchoative auxiliary already in medieval Spanish. So this suggests that echar is like the exemplary verb, which then opened the pathway for other throw verbs to be, well, attracted to the aspectual inchoative domain. So it's probable that through analogy, other near synonymous verbs such as tirar, arrojar, and lanzar were then attracted to the schema in later phases. I will come back to this later. Okay, so I think that the grammaticalization account, as I have just exposed, is highly valuable, of course, for a number of reasons. And among these reasons is the fact that, well, it allows us to describe a systematic path if we follow Heine's model. And it allows to make generalizations over the historical development of particular instances. However, I think that if we would stop the analysis here, if this would be the end of my presentation, I think there are like several questions that remain unanswered, as if they are like a black hole. So what, for instance, about the different time phrases for the different verbs? So we saw echar, but then the other verbs that pop up later on in the history. What about the particular relationships between those four variants? So why are they there? Are there any collocational restrictions between the type of auxiliary and the type of infinitive? And are there, during history, are there different degrees of productivity? And this is, of course, where the constructionalization account comes in. So, in fact, without questioning the value of the grammaticalization account, I would like to partially rethink the integration of the throw verbs into the inchoative construction in terms of the constructional approach. So, we would say then that we have an inchoative construction with 4 different slots. That the construction can be defined as a semi-schematic construction, where the grammaticalized element here, the auxiliary, is then the most important element of the construction. And then we have an open slot where different lexical items can be collocated, and they are collocated with the auxiliary grammaticalizing element. Moreover, if we then adopt the onomasiological approach, which, as I said before, is also typical of the constructional account, in fact, we could say that the inchoative recruits the semi-auxiliary verbs from at least 6 different semantic fields. So we have the superlexicals, we have put verbs, we have the throw verbs, of course, but we also have movement verbs, we have manipulation verbs, and we also have destruction verbs. Okay, so given all this, in the constructional viewpoint, we would then postulate that speakers have a mental inchoative schema in mind. And at a lower construction hierarchy, there are then several sub-schemas that are created through metaphor, as I showed before, for the throw verbs. But there, you could do the same, and I did the same for another conference with destruction verbs. There are also put verbs, etc. Now, previous analysis showed that, in fact, that inchoative schema developed already in the 13th century and is, in fact, an inherited schema from Latin. There is some contamination of a construction with a gerund and another one with an infinitive. And what happens then is that this schema that already apparently exists has been strengthened through the development first of a sub-schema in the 13th century with put verbs, then already also in medieval Spanish with throw verbs, as we saw before, which of course also refer to spatial expressions. And then later on, in classical Spanish, the schema was strengthened through the rise and development of the sub-schema with destruction verbs. So the other domains that I mentioned, such as movement, etc., they remain to be investigated in the near future. But interestingly, you can see in the diachronic data that the overall schema has been strengthened every time a different sub-schema was added. Now, we are, of course, interested in the rise and development of this one. So, therefore, I think that it would be particularly interesting to look into the behavior of inchoative microconstructions, which are then the constructions introduced by the different verbs, the different throw verbs. We will have a look at them very quickly in terms of their productivity and also in terms of their semantic profile. So these are the empirical data, and the table gives an overview of the frequency of the 4 microconstructions with inchoatives, and also in each century. As I said, echar already appears in the 13th century, arrojar here in the 16th century, lanzar in the 19th, and then tirar in the 20th century. So we have a data set of over 2,800 tokens. Now, this overview also shows that the frequencies between the different microconstructions, they vary a lot, and also if you compare the different centuries. And we already know that echar is the most frequent auxiliary, so that it has an exemplary role in this sub-schema. Okay, we also see that here, arrojar and tirar, they present more or less the same amount of tokens in present-day Spanish as well. You could say that they have an intermediate token frequency, and then lanzar is observed quite late, so in the 19th century in the data, but it becomes immediately quite frequent. So we could say that today it is the second most frequent throw inchoative auxiliary verb. Okay, so back to the constructional viewpoint. Now, it's interesting to have a look at the internal dynamics between the microconstructions, which is something that the grammaticalization account does less. So we could, for instance, zoom in on their degree of productivity, which in the literature has been defined as an important diagnostic of constructional change. So we could have a look at their basic productivity measures, such as which you probably know. So these are like token frequency, or the number of occurrences of the construction, the type frequency, so the number of different types that instantiate the construction, and the hapax frequency, so the number of types which occur only once in a corpus or a text. So we work with type token and hapax token ratio, and the idea is the higher those numbers, the more productive the construction is. So the more probable it is that the microconstruction in the future will expand even more. So we already know this table, and you see that in general, the inchoative construction becomes more frequent over time. So it really becomes a stronger schema, becomes more productive. And we already know that echar is more token frequent than, for instance, lanzar. That is the second most frequent one. But the difference becomes smaller in present-day Spanish. Now, the other productivity measures, and this is interesting, namely of type token ratio and hapax token ratio, they provide us with another image because it shows that lanzar, which is indicated here in orange, as opposed to echar, would be the more productive one. So you see that for echar, the type token ratio, hapax token ratio, it's quite stable. There is a peak in the 18th century, but then it really decreases. So what we have here then is that speakers, they use the constructions more frequently, but they do it with a more limited group of infinitives. On the contrary, if we have a look at lanzar, that appears later on in the history, it immediately appears with a broader set of different infinitives. Okay. Now, as a last step, an important connection needs to be made between productivity and semantics, because, it could be interesting to have a look at the different semantic classes that are observed in the infinitive slot. So the idea is also, if you have more different semantic classes there, the microconstruction, so the small variant, is more productive. So without going into detail, we use a particular classification that is the ADESE classification that includes a very wide set of different lexical classes, so mental verbs, verbal verbs, existential verbs. So it allows us to label the type of infinitive. And if we look at the two microconstructions with echar and with lanzar, so you see that again, echar, it remains quite stable. Apparently, the infinitives that it combines with, although there are a lot of more tokens, they only pertain to 12 different lexical classes, whereas with lanzar, it opens up to 43 different semantic classes. So echar is like more specialized. So we could say that echar has become like a lexicalized microconstruction. And also here, if we take a look at the top 10 of the most frequent infinitives of the microconstruction with echar, we see that in fact, already from the 19th century on, so the same infinitives, they appear with high frequency, so echar a reír, echar a correr, echar a andar, etc. So we could say that echar tends to appear in lexicalized constructions, whereas lanzar combines with an extended series of infrequent infinitives. Okay, last step. It's interesting then to reflect on how the other members of the field of drawing were incorporated into the inchoative schema, because that is typical of the constructional approach to ask that kind of questions. Now, I don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but I postulate that the low-frequent microconstruction, so mostly with the exotic verbs like arrojar and tirar, but also lanzar to some extent, in fact, they have emerged through analogy with echar, but in order to compensate for the gap that was created by the lexicalization of the microconstruction with echar. So what you had at some point in time were recurrent collocations, recurrent uses of echar a reír, echar a llorar, echar a andar. And so that microconstruction lost its expressive value. So if speakers then wanted to be creative and enhance the expressive value of the inchoative, they had to turn to related but more creative auxiliaries. So, in fact, the rise of the inchoative draw subschema confirms previous tendencies observed in the literature. So, with respect to the importance of analogy, and I quote, language users recognize similarities, generalize, and they group things together by analogical reasoning. So that's analogy, also inherent to the grammaticalization account. And then they can use these schemas for the production of new words. So in fact, what I want to highlight here is that in the evolution of inchoatives, of auxiliaries, of schemas, and the role of expressivity should not be underestimated. So in fact, language innovations, they occur because speakers, they do not want to express themselves the same way as others do. And then the renewal that we observe within the inchoative construction might be explained by the wish to desire to be extravagant. And that is, of course, what Keller also said before. So talk in such a way that you are noticed. But the extravagance, it seems to say, within the limits of the specific semantic domain, in this case, the domain of the throw verbs. Okay, I hope I'm doing fine as to my time, but I have a very short conclusion. So with my presentation, I hope to have shown that within the functional approaches to language in general, language change in particular, the diachronic constructional approach, the constructionalization approach, has really important merits. So I try to argue that the best way to advance our understanding of the rise and development of the inchoative in Spanish is then by integrating insights from grammaticalization and construction grammar. Now, whereas the fundamental notions of grammaticalization, such as analogy, such as metaphorical extensions, remain key, and that's what I also showed, the constructional approach provided further insight into the changing relationship between the different variants, so between the micro-constructions. So there are changing relationships over time, and of course, including also the importance of expressivity. Okay, that was it. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Renata. Thank you so much. And we'll turn to our last presenter, Professor Carlos Gouveia from Lisbon. I não sei se você está em Lisboa.
Não estou.
Mas enfim. Está?
Não.
Não
eu
estou.
não moro.
Eu
não moro em Lisboa.
Eu sei, Carlos. Eu falei onde todo mundo estava, né? Mas enfim. Obrigada por aceitar nosso convite. E passo a palavra para você, sem mais delongas.
Ok, muito obrigado, Flávia. Eu queria começar precisamente por agradecer à Flávia, ao grupo todo de gramática discursiva funcional brasileiro e, sobretudo, em particular, ao Sebastião Carlos, que teve a amabilidade de me contactar para participar nesta mesa. Um abraço para todos e muito obrigado. Eu estou aqui dividido entre o que fazer em termos de expressão linguística. Eu mandei um título em português, mandei um resumo, um abstract em português, mas depois coloquei a dúvida se deveria usar o português ou o inglês nesta apresentação. E decidi pelo meio termo, ou seja, apesar de um título em português, apesar de um resumo em português, eu resolvi que iria fazer a apresentação mostrando slides em inglês e falando em português com uma mistura de inglês pelo meio, eventualmente. Portanto, perdoem-me a salada de línguas, mas parece-me mais adequado para a diversidade de público e das línguas faladas pelo público. Eu vou falar de aspectos de coesão lexical em português europeu a partir de uma posição teórica particular que se enquadra no tema desta mesa redonda, Funcionalismo e Funcionalismos, que é o enquadramento da linguística sistémico-funcional. Portanto, o meu ponto de partida é a linguística sistémico-funcional e é a partir dessa posição teórica que vou falar de alguns aspectos de coesão lexical. O ponto fundamental da apresentação não será tanto falar de coesão lexical, mas problematizar alguns aspectos relativos à coesão lexical. A minha apresentação, portanto, nesse sentido, não é uma apresentação muito bem estruturada, digamos assim, porque ela visa, sobretudo, problematizar, ela visa, sobretudo, levantar algumas questões, para as quais eu não tenho necessariamente resposta, diga-se de passagem, tenho tentativas de resposta. Mas, de facto, aquilo que eu quero fazer aqui é problematizar. Nesse sentido, afasto-me um pouco das duas apresentações anteriores, que agradeço muito e cumprimento efusivamente a Hela e a Renata pela excelência das suas apresentações, com as quais aprendi e relativamente às quais vi algumas semelhanças, de facto, de enquadramento teórico, apesar de trabalharmos em enquadramentos muito distintos. Portanto, considerando esta temática, funcionalismo e funcionalismos, eu tentei trazer uma preocupação que é minha relativamente a como lidar com aspectos que eu acho que são muito específicos da língua portuguesa, e particularmente do português europeu, mas eu acho que aí também o português brasileiro se comporta de forma muito semelhante, aspectos que têm a ver com práticas de uso do português nos textos. E, portanto, eu começaria, ou vou começar precisamente por apresentar 3 pontos de partida, departure points, como eu lhes chamo, podia chamar premises, portanto, premissas, chamo-lhes pontos de partida, e o primeiro ponto são as 3 citações de Michael Halliday. O primeiro ponto diz isto: every text, that is, everything that is said or written, unfolds in some context of use. Furthermore, it is the uses of language that over tens of thousands of generations have shaped the system. Language has evolved to satisfy human needs, and the way it is organized is functional with respect to those needs. It is not arbitrary. Eu cito muito este fragmento de Halliday porque ele levanta várias questões e, de alguma forma, explicita aspectos muito importantes do ponto de vista teórico. E esta oposição, por exemplo, organized, the way it is organized is functional with respect to those needs. Portanto, a ideia das necessidades dos falantes e a organização do sistema funcionalmente em razão dessas necessidades. Portanto, este é o ponto de partida primeiro. O ponto de partida segundo, outra citação do Halliday, como eu disse, que diz the theory on which this description is based, e ele está a falar da sua descrição, e é válida para a descrição que eu vou fazer nesta apresentação, the theory on which this description is based, systemic theory, follows in the European functional tradition. It is largely based on Firth's system structure theory, but derives more abstract principles from Hjelmslev and owes many ideas to the Prague School. The organization concept is that of the system, which is used essentially in Firth's sense of a functional paradigm, but developed into the formal construct of a system network. This system network is a theory about language as a resource for making meaning. Each system in the network represents a choice, not a conscious decision made in real time, but a set of possible alternatives, like statement question, or singular plural, or falling tone, level tone, rising tone. Okay? So, este é o departure point 2, o ponto de partida 2. Vamos ver agora o ponto de partida 3. Terceira citação do Halliday, do mesmo texto, que é um texto absolutamente fundamental, que é a introdução à segunda edição da gramática, da introdução à gramática funcional. E ele diz: "It is of little use having an elegant theory of the system if it cannot account for how the system engenders text. Equally, it adds little to expatiate on a text if one cannot relate it to the system that lies behind, since anyone understanding the text does so only because they know the system. Up to the limits of delicacy to which the analysis is taken, therefore, every feature of a text can be related to the overall system of English." Destas três premissas, destes três pontos de partida, nós podemos retirar três princípios, ou seja, do ponto de partida 1, o princípio fundamental é o de que o sistema é estruturado, é motivado pelo uso. Ou seja, the system is structured, shaped by usage. Portanto, o sistema é estruturado, motivado pelo uso, decorre do ponto de partida 1, enquanto princípio. E do ponto de partida 2, o princípio que podemos extrair é a significação resulta de escolhas funcionais. Portanto, a significação resulta de escolhas funcionais. Escolhas funcionais são escolhas contextualizadas, são escolhas que, efetivamente, seguem o princípio da alternância, da possibilidade de escolha entre uma coisa e outra, contextualmente, motivadas pelo contexto. Do ponto de partida 3, podemos retirar o seguinte princípio: os textos são janelas para a compreensão e descrição do sistema. Isto é, a minha compreensão e a minha descrição do sistema decorre da possibilidade que eu tenho de olhar para os textos e os descrever, vendo-os como janelas para um universo mais amplo, que é o sistema que os concretizou, digamos assim, ou que lhes possibilitou a sua concretização. Okay? Portanto, três princípios que eu acho fundamentais para lidar com o problema que vos venho trazer hoje aqui. Portanto, é, digamos assim, à luz destes três princípios que eu gostaria de problematizar os dados que vos trago. À luz destes três princípios, podemos colocar-nos a seguinte questão: o que é que cada um dos textos que vou apresentar a seguir, que são textos escritos nas duas línguas, isto é, em português e em inglês, o que é que cada um dos textos que vos vou apresentar nos diz, nesta perspectiva dos textos enquanto janelas para o sistema, o que é que cada um destes textos nos diz sobre os sistemas que os concretizam, okay? Os sistemas que possibilitam a sua concretização enquanto textos. O que é que cada um destes textos nos diz? E, obviamente, que o nosso horizonte, digamos assim, de problematização é a questão da coesão lexical, não é? Então, o primeiro texto que vos trago é um texto em inglês que vou ler, está escrito da seguinte forma, é um texto escrito e lê-se assim: "Open the printer's top cover and remove the packing tape securing the print cartridge cradle. Open the print cartridge container. Grasp the print cartridge by the green arrow and remove the print cartridge from the container. Be careful not to touch the copper ribbon. Gently remove the tape from the print cartridge. Set the print cartridge in the cradle with the green arrow on the cartridge top, pointing to the green dot on top of the cradle. Push the green arrow forward toward the green dot to snap the cartridge into place. Close the printer's top cover." Portanto, este é o primeiro texto que vos trago. Não esqueçamos a pergunta que está presente no slide que estou a apresentar. o que é que estes textos nos dizem sobre os sistemas que os concretizam. O texto seguinte é um outro texto em inglês que se lê assim: If your cat strays, you will have a better chance of getting it back if it can be identified. An ID tag on the collar or a microchip can help identify your cat. You can also save costs and help your cat by having it desexed and microchipped at the same time. Thousands of beautiful cats have to be destroyed each year because they cannot be reunited with their owners. Cats that are not identified may be lawfully seized, detained, destroyed, or otherwise disposed. Don't let that happen to your cat. E agora um texto em português, neste caso em português europeu, o texto 3, que lê assim: fácil, intuitivo, evoluído. O Sensor Connect 2 é o mais avançado esquentador do mercado, de design inovador e tecnologia conectiva que permite o seu controlo a partir de smartphones ou tablets. Equipado com um display digital touch muito intuitivo, permite uma fácil interação e o controle total do aparelho. Elegante e moderno, o Sensor Connect 2 é o primeiro esquentador compacto com frente em vidro negro. O seu display digital touch é muito intuitivo. Pode aceder facilmente a dados como temperatura ou consumo em tempo real através do seu display LCD. O novo Sensor Connect 2 vem com uma aplicação gratuita compatível com smartphones ou tablets via Wi-Fi, que permite, por exemplo, consultar os gráficos dos últimos consumos de água e gás, fixar parâmetros de conforto do equipamento e controlar a temperatura desejada. E, por fim, o texto número 4, um segundo texto em português. Portanto, 2 textos em inglês, 2 textos em português. Alimenta o seu gato a intervalos regulares e nunca lhe dê restos. Dê-lhe de comer em pratos só dele. Proporcione-lhe uma cama própria, onde ele saiba que pode descansar tranquilo e sem ser incomodado. Mantenha o pelo do seu gato limpo e tratado, escovando-o regularmente, sobretudo se ele tem pelo comprido. Coloque na coleira do seu gato uma placa identificadora com o seu número de telefone. Escolha um médico veterinário logo após adquirir o seu gato e não apenas quando acontece uma emergência. Aconselhe-se com o médico veterinário se não quiser que o seu animal de companhia procrie. Mantenha as vacinas do seu gato em dia. Transporte sempre o seu gato dentro de uma caixa própria para o efeito. Nunca abandone o seu gato. Ninguém abandona o melhor amigo. Ok? 4 textos, 2 textos em inglês, 2 textos em português. Pegando no elemento, no lexema, digamos assim, que define sobre o que é cada um destes textos, portanto, aquilo que poderíamos eleger como um lexema fundamental para a compreensão de sobre o que é aquele texto, e pegando nas relações coesivas que são dependentes da identidade de referência ao longo do texto, que são não apenas relações coesivas de coesão lexical, mas também são de coesão gramatical, de tipo de referência e substituição, pegando nesses aspectos e pegando em cada um dos lexemas que poderemos considerar fundamentais para cada um dos 4 textos. No texto 1, o lexema fundamental é cartridge, que ocorre 8 vezes em 97 palavras, ou seja, 8,2% do texto. No texto 2, o segundo texto em inglês, a palavra cat, que aparece 6 vezes em 91 palavras. E depois temos os exemplos portugueses, em que temos a palavra esquentador, que aparece 2 vezes num texto com 49 palavras, e a palavra gato, que aparece 7 vezes, mas num texto em que tem 129 palavras. Ou seja, estamos com níveis de percentagem muito diversos nos textos em inglês e nos textos em português. Não se iludam com a relativa semelhança, estamos sempre na casa de abaixo dos 10%, mas é uma diferença bastante acentuada, como iremos verificar a seguir. Ou seja, os textos portugueses e os textos em inglês comportam-se, de facto, de forma diversa. Reparem, só para perceberem de que é que estamos a falar, porque eu apenas estou a contabilizar coesão lexical, ou seja, a repetição do mesmo lexema, por reiteração, portanto, a reiteração por repetição do mesmo lexema. No texto 2 estamos a falar, por exemplo, da palavra cat, não é? Que aparece 6 vezes, e no texto 3, o exemplo do inglês, estamos a falar da palavra esquentador, que aparece 2 vezes, por exemplo, mas que é substituída, ou melhor, é reiterada, digamos assim, não por repetição, mas por sinonímia em aparelho e equipamento. Portanto, é disto que estamos a falar. Eu não contabilizei nem aparelho nem equipamento naqueles dados, contabilizei apenas a repetição. Portanto, aqueles dados dizem respeito apenas à repetição daquele lexema fundamental para a compreensão do texto. Ora bem, de acordo com conclusões num outro texto, Ghouveia 2003, podemos, de facto, afirmar, de acordo também com aquilo que vimos agora, com estes nossos 4 textos, que parece que os utentes da língua inglesa recorrem mais à reiteração por repetição do que os utentes da língua portuguesa na sua variedade europeia. Portanto, parece, de facto, que é esta a tendência. Mais repetição nos textos em inglês, ou seja, os falantes ingleses usam mais a repetição, a reiteração por repetição, e parece que os portugueses ou os falantes de português europeu favorecem a reiteração por sinonímia. Portanto, a não repetição, de facto, do mesmo lexema, mas o trabalho sobre um sinónimo do lexema fundamental. Também parece óbvio que, sempre que possível, a partir dos dados e dos dados de Ghouveia 2003, parece-me que sempre que possível os utentes de usuários de português europeu recorrem a estruturas coesivas, estruturas de coesão gramatical, como a substituição e a referência, como forma de estabelecer elos coesivos com um lexema fundamental. E fazem isto mais vezes, aparentemente, do que os utentes ou usuários da língua inglesa. Estas conclusões, digamos assim, parecem ecoar a percepção que os utentes, usuários da língua portuguesa europeia, na Europa, e provavelmente também os usuários da língua portuguesa no Brasil, da variedade brasileira, esta percepção de que escrever, o ato de escrita, envolve evitar repetições. Ou seja, a procura de um sinónimo para uma palavra é uma tarefa tradicional na escrita em português. Pelo menos em português europeu, assim é, e penso que será também em português do Brasil. Parece-me óbvio que isto é uma questão, uma matéria de ensino de língua, ensino e aprendizagem de língua, e é uma questão também, para mim, óbvia de literacia, ou, como se diz no Brasil, letramento. E, portanto, nessa acessão de literacia, como associada a esta citação do Halliday, que diz que se está a referir specifically to writing as distinct from speech, to reading and writing practices and to the forms of language and ways of meaning that are typically associated with them. Portanto, nós estamos, de facto, a falar de uma questão que é fundamentalmente associada à língua escrita. Okay? E, portanto, daí que tem a ver com ensino e aprendizagem da língua e também com questões de literacia / letramento. Okay? Como é que a questão que me interessa, e por isso é que eu dizia que esta apresentação é muito de problematização, como é que nós podemos lidar, teoricamente, com estas conclusões ou com estas pseudo-conclusões, se não quiserem acreditar nas mesmas, isto é, de facto, é uma perspectiva de desenvolvimento, e a pergunta que se coloca é, de facto, esta. Como é que podemos lidar com isto teoricamente? Podemos olhar para esta característica dos textos em português, ou seja, o favorecimento da sinonímia em detrimento da repetição. Podemos olhar para esta característica ou a característica distinta dos textos em inglês como relacionadas com o sistema que instancia os textos, ou seja, podemos dizer que há algo no sistema linguístico português, no sistema linguístico do português europeu, que possibilita ou motiva, digamos assim, este recurso à sinonímia, ao passo que a característica no inglês será diferente porque possibilita ou favorece o recurso à repetição, tendencialmente. A pergunta que nos podemos colocar é se isto corresponde, de facto, a algo que no sistema representa a escolha. A partir daquela ideia do princípio, digamos assim, 3, de que falava há pouco. Portanto, a ideia da significação como escolha. E, portanto, pensar nisto, se de facto corresponde a esta questão do sistema, uma forma de o sistema representar a escolha. Esta característica que identificamos. Portanto, como continuar com este aspecto, como lidar com isto teoricamente, poderemos dizer que no quadro da linguística sistémica ou funcional há duas dimensões globais fundamentais que ajudam a explicar muitos aspectos da teoria. Uma dessas dimensões é o contínuo de concretização, tradução possível para decline of instantiation, que está registado no slide, portanto, o contínuo de concretização e a hierarquia de estratificação. São duas dimensões muito importantes para explicar, digamos assim, o funcionamento dos sistemas linguísticos. E eu trago-vos esta citação que me parece importante para a problematização teórica daquilo com que estamos a lidar, esta citação de Mathieson, Terui e Lam, que diz: "Decline of instantiation emerges when instances of potentially symbolic behavior become systemic." E é esta a pergunta, é saber se a característica com que estamos a lidar se tornou sistémica na prática. That is, so the decline of instantiation emerges when instances of potentially symbolic behavior become systemic. That is, when they occur again as instances of systemic contrasts. E as instances of systemic contrasts means que elas fazem parte de uma rede de sistema de escolhas. Okay? E isto tem a ver com os princípios de que parti inicialmente nesta apresentação. O contínuo de concretização pode ser representado de muitas formas. Trago-vos aqui uma forma entre muitas possíveis, em que nós temos o contínuo e basicamente o contínuo é, neste caso, top-down, portanto, de cima para baixo, isto é do sistema para a concretização, do sistema para o texto. A ideia de ter duas setas ou bidirecional neste contínuo tem a ver apenas com o movimento da descrição do ponto de vista do linguista, não é? Do ponto de vista do sistema e do funcionamento do sistema em textos é, obviamente, a direção de cima para baixo. e só deveria ter uma seta, mas tem duas precisamente porque ela pretende também representar as duas possibilidades de olhar, e já vamos ver quais são as duas possibilidades de olhar para a descrição, digamos assim, linguística. Portanto, do ponto de vista deste contínuo de concretização, nós temos o sistema linguístico, não é? E o sistema linguístico, na prática, representa o potencial de significação. Não esqueçamos que esta é uma teoria, digamos assim, é uma teoria efetivamente orientada para o significado, não é? E, portanto, o que nós temos é o sistema. Esse sistema é visto como a potencialidade de significação. Depois, nesse contínuo, vamos andando até chegarmos ao significado efetivo, ao significado real, que acontece no texto, tal como ele foi concretizado, digamos assim, num determinado contexto, com participantes em específico, participantes particulares. Neste contínuo de concretização, temos momentos vários, ou seja, temos na prática o sistema no topo, o Language as System, depois temos Language as Subsystems and Types of Instances, quando lidamos, por exemplo, com instituições e com registros particulares, digamos assim, associados a instituições, por exemplo, a academia e os géneros e registros da academia, por exemplo, são subsistemas, digamos assim, no sistema linguístico e, portanto, representam possibilidades de significação para chegarmos ao momento da língua enquanto tipos de textos, enquanto textos particulares de um determinado tipo, que são a concretização do texto. Nesta visão deste contínuo de concretização, podemos olhar também para aquilo que eu dizia há pouco a propósito das duas setas nesta representação, que é o movimento, digamos assim, do ponto de vista do analista, não do ponto de vista da organização e funcionamento do sistema, mas do ponto de vista do analista, se de facto o analista olha para os textos a partir do sistema linguístico e para a sua concretização em textos, olha para os textos como artefactos. E neste sentido estamos perante uma dimensão analítica que é típica da análise do discurso. Não é? É percebermos o funcionamento dos textos nos seus contextos enquanto artefactos potenciados, digamos assim, por um sistema linguístico particular. Na outra perspectiva, que é a perspectiva que aqui estamos a adotar nesta apresentação, estamos a olhar para os textos enquanto espécimes, ok? E olhar para os textos enquanto espécimes é o princípio 2 de há pouco, com que abrimos esta apresentação, que é a ideia do texto como janela para o sistema, ok? E, portanto, nesta perspectiva, olhamos para os textos para perceber o sistema. Okay? Para perceber o funcionamento do sistema e como é que o sistema funciona enquanto rede de sistemas ou sistemas interrelacionados, digamos assim. Portanto, a perspectiva que estamos aqui a adotar não é a perspectiva da análise do discurso, de olharmos para os textos enquanto artefactos possibilitados por um sistema linguístico, é olhar para os textos para perceber o funcionamento do sistema. Ou problematizar, como eu lhe chamei, o funcionamento do sistema, ou teorizar sobre o sistema linguístico a partir da realidade textual. E, portanto, para continuarmos neste tom ou nesta perspectiva, não esqueçamos qual é o traço fundamental com que estamos a lidar, que é este, que é o facto de, na coesão lexical em português, os usuários da língua favorecerem a sinonímia e a referência e a substituição, enquanto fenómenos de coesão gramatical, contra, digamos assim, a repetição. Ou seja, favorecer determinados tipos de coesão em detrimento contra, reagindo por oposição à repetição. E a pergunta que se coloca, à luz daquilo que eu acabei de explicar há pouco sobre o contínuo de instância de concretização, é esta característica, este traço, digamos assim, de utilização, de uso da língua é sistémico, isto é, tornou-se parte do sistema linguístico português? Se sim, então deveríamos ser capazes, deveria ser possível estabelecer a rede do sistema que potencia isso em relação com outros sistemas. Ok? Em relação, por exemplo, com o sistema e uso da repetição, em relação com a coesão lexical em si, por exemplo, o sistema da coesão lexical em português, na relação com a coesão gramatical, especificamente gramatical. Portanto, não estamos a falar de uma questão apenas de descrição, ok? Não estamos a falar de descrever a coesão dos textos apenas, entendê-la e descrevê-la, sistematizá-la. Estamos a falar de significado enquanto escolha. Ou seja, enquanto escolha, este fenómeno precisa de ser explicado de um ponto de vista funcional, a partir de uma perspectiva funcional. Okay? Dentro daquela possibilidade do contínuo de concretização, onde é que nós situamos esta característica? É uma característica, digamos assim, da língua enquanto subsistema, isto é, ao nível das instituições, ao nível de determinados géneros, ao nível de determinados registros. Pessoalmente acho que não me parece. E, portanto, eu acho que ela é uma característica que, de alguma forma, se tornou sistémica. Como tal, apenas uma abordagem funcional, quer-me parecer, pode explicar esta característica. É isso que eu acho que poderemos fazer, e poderemos fazê-lo quer na perspectiva, digamos assim, da linguística sistémica ou funcional, mas também a partir de qualquer perspectiva, digamos, que parta de um enquadramento que seja funcionalista. Okay? E, portanto, foi esta a minha participação, digamos assim, numa mesa que pretendia trabalhar a questão do funcionalismo e funcionalismos. Muito obrigado por me convidarem e, sobretudo, por me terem ouvido. Não ouço.
Thank you so much. Oh, I forgot. After 2 years and a half, thank you so much for your presentations. I'm afraid we won't have enough time to send you to make you the questions that are that were posted in the chat, but I'll send them to you afterwards. There were 2 questions for Renata, 1 question for Hela, and probably some questions for Carlos now. I'm afraid we will have to finish because we have another session now and it's within this virtual world. So thank you so much. And I hope to see you soon in person. And that's it. Do you want to say something else?
Só uma pergunta. Chamaste-me a atenção para o tempo. É que eu não reparei.
No, I didn't, because everything was late, so you were still in your time. So that's it.
Good.
One thing I didn't. I was the one who never thanked for the invitation. I thank you very much for the invitation. I found it great. Thank you very much, and I really enjoyed what you two, Renata and Carlos, falaram. Obrigada.
Thank you.
Bom, muito obrigada pelo convite, tá? Ok. Até.
Obrigado.
As we say here in Brazil, sextou. For you in Europe, it's late, so go enjoy your evening. And Carlos, happy birthday.
Thank you. Yes, today is my birthday. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. Go partying now. Bye-bye.
I'm going for drinks now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.